Ted Bundy. Theodore Bundy was an American serial killer who murdered numerous young women during the 1970s. He was known for his charm and intelligence, which he used to lure his victims before brutally assaulting and murdering them. Bundy's crimes spanned several states, and he was executed in 1989. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He was known for his gruesome acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment and was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer and sex offender who sexually assaulted and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men between 1972 and 1978. He often performed at children's parties and charitable events as Pogo the Clown. Gacy was executed in 1994. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer who murdered 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. She claimed that the killings were in self-defense, as the men had either raped or attempted to rape her while she was working as a prostitute. Wuornos was executed in 2002. Ed Gein. Edward Gein was an American murderer and body snatcher who inspired the creation of several fictional characters in horror films, including Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Gein murdered 2 women in the 1950s and exhumed corpses from graves to fashion trophies and keepsakes from their remains. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered and mutilated at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. He was known for his brutal methods of killing and sexually assaulting his victims. Chikatilo was executed in 1994. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer and rapist who terrorized Southern California during the mid-1980s. He broke into homes at night, assaulting and murdering his victims in brutal fashion. Ramirez was convicted in 1989 and died in prison in 2013. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill, was an American serial killer who murdered 10 people in Kansas between 1974 and 1991. He taunted police and media with letters describing his crimes and went undetected for decades before being arrested in 2005. Rader is serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam, was an American serial killer who terrorized New York City during the summer of 1977. He targeted young women and couples, shooting them with a .44 caliber revolver. Berkowitz was captured in 1977 and is serving 6 consecutive life sentences. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, was an American serial killer who murdered numerous women in Washington state during the 1980s and 1990s. He targeted prostitutes and runaways, strangling them and dumping their bodies in remote areas. Ridgway was arrested in 2001 and is serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was an American cult leader who orchestrated a series of gruesome murders with his followers, known as the Manson family, in the late 1960s. Although Manson himself did not commit the murders, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Manson died in 2017. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man or the Werewolf of Wisteria, was an American serial killer, child rapist, and cannibal who confessed to the murders of several children in the 1920s and 1930s. He was known for his depraved acts and was executed by electric chair in 1936. Pedro Alonso López. Pedro Alonso López, known as the Monster of the Andes, is a Colombian serial killer who confessed to the rape, torture, and murder of more than 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru during the 1970s. He was convicted of killing 110 girls in Ecuador in 1980 and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. López was released in 1998 for good behavior, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Richard Chase. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was an American serial killer who murdered 6 people in California during a month-long spree in 1977. He drank the blood of some of his victims and engaged in acts of necrophilia. Chase was captured, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1979. He died by suicide in his prison cell in 1980. Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin, known as the chessboard killer, is a Russian serial killer who murdered at least 49 people in Moscow's Bitsa Park between 2001 and 2006. He targeted homeless and elderly people, luring them with alcohol before bludgeoning them to death with a hammer. Pichushkin was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to life imprisonment.